The woman known to history as Isabella of France or Queen Isabella of England was born at some point in the mid-1290s in Paris in France, most likely in 1295 or possibly 1296. The exact date is unclear, a not uncommon occurrence when it comes to medieval births, for which records can often be fragmentary. Her father was King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair on account of his alleged good looks. He had succeeded to the French throne in 1284. Philip was also King of Navarre on account of his marriage to Isabella's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, a small kingdom which lay primarily on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees in what is now the Basque country in the northeast of Spain. She and Philip had married in 1284. Isabella was their sixth child. 2 daughters had been born before her, Margaret at some point in the late 1280s, and Blanche in 1290. Blanche died when she was 3 years old in 1294, before Isabella came into the world, and Margaret would also die in childhood in 1300, making Isabella her father's only daughter within a few years of her birth, and hence a valuable bargaining chip when it came to the politics of Western Europe. Isabella also had 4 brothers: Louis, born in 1289, Philippe, born around 1291, Charles, born in 1294, and Robert, born in 1296 or 1297, and thus Isabella's only younger sibling. Robert would die too in childhood, but Louis, Philippe, and Charles would each live to become kings of France and Navarre, one after another. The political circumstances of both France and England by the time of her birth in the late 13th century are critical to understanding the trajectory of Isabella's entire life. Unlike in early modern and modern times, France was not a united kingdom during either the High Middle Ages or the later medieval period. It was deeply divided, with powers such as the Dukes of Burgundy holding extensive lands in the east of the country, and others, such as the Counts of Flanders, dominating the region around much of Belgium and northeastern France. The papacy in Rome even controlled a small fiefdom in southern France centred on the city of Avignon. The kings of France nominally claimed control over the whole country, yet their power was prone to rising and falling over the decades, with various nobles and lords exercising great amounts of independence when there were weak rulers in Paris. In contrast, King Edward I of England had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe since his accession in 1272, imposing English control over Wales and also waging war on Scotland to try to unify all of Britain under his rule, while he also held extensive lands in Ireland. In France, Edward held much of the southwest of the country around Bordeaux and its hinterland as Duke of Aquitaine, though this was a far cry from his predecessors in the 12th century, who at one time had held nearly half of the territory of modern-day France, with vast regions in the north and west being under English control. What this French legacy meant was that the affairs of the kings of England and France were inextricably interconnected, and this would impact on Isabella's life when she was just a child. It would continue to do so down to the end of her life, and her son would attempt to impose himself as King of France from the late 1330s onwards. Unlike many of her predecessors as Queen of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, there are a large number of sources extant today for the study of Isabella's life. Many of these were chronicles written in the medieval tradition by figures like Thomas Walsingham, a late 14th century Benedictine monk who wrote an extensive history of the rulers of England from the early 14th century up to his own time. Another was Walter of Swinbrook, whose Chronicon Angliae, or English Chronicle, charted the reigns of Isabella's husband Edward II and her son Edward III, in the process providing many details on Isabella herself and her role in both. A French chronicler, Guillaume de Nangis, wrote extensively on events at the end of the 13th century in a way which pertains to Isabella's very earliest years and the circumstances that gave rise to her marriage with Edward II. Similarly, the Wigmore Chronicles, a set of annals of major events in English history between the middle of the 11th century and the start of the 14th, also casts light on the political circumstances in England when Isabella arrived there, while there was a growing amount of bureaucratic records being produced in 14th century England due to it being the most centralized state in Western Europe at the time. Yet these sources have their limitations. Medieval chroniclers did not write with the aim of maintaining an objective perspective as modern historians aspire to. Instead, they often wrote to persuade their readers of their own political views, and so many presented Isabella in a negative light for her actions in disobeying the normal bonds of matrimony at the time. As will become clear, though, her actions were often those of a woman who had learned from a young age to survive by her wits. In a somewhat unusual development which points to the evolution of European society on the cusp of the Renaissance, Isabella was afforded an elite education, something which was not customary for women in the 13th century for the most part, and which had only become common for royal princes in the 12th century. Many rulers as recently as the 11th century had been illiterate and left the business of government largely to church figures and scribes, considering warfare their true domain. Around the Louvre Palace and the Palais de la Cité in Paris, she was surrounded by some of the leading scholars of the age at the University of Paris, and at her father's court she had access to tutors from a young age and a wide library. She grew up, as a result, to be one of the most educated royal women of the High Middle Ages. From the moment she was born, her father was doubtlessly considering who she would be married to. Incredibly, Philip had betrothed one of his daughters, Blanche, to the Infante or Prince of Castile, the future King Ferdinand IV, when she was just an infant, the better to ally France with the powerful Spanish kingdom. When she died, he then betrothed his daughter Margaret to Ferdinand, but when Margaret too passed in 1300, he declined to arrange for his final daughter to potentially marry the Castilian prince. The reason was that Isabella, who was perhaps as young as 3 or 4 years of age at the time, had been promised to Prince Edward of England, the son and heir of King Edward I, in 1299. In 1294, Isabella's father had gone to war with England in an effort to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward I while he was otherwise distracted by a war in Scotland. This unhappy conflict dragged on for several years without any conclusive results on both sides, and by 1297, both parties had decided that continuing the conflict was not worth the cost in men and money. Peace negotiations were entered into and were finally concluded in 1299 when the 60-year-old Edward I, a widower for nearly a decade, married Philip's 17-year-old sister Marguerite, while Isabella was betrothed to Prince Edward, who at least was closer to her in age, having turned 15 in the spring of 1299. The match remained simply a betrothal at this early stage, Isabella being considered too young for a marriage to actually take place even by the standards of the medieval period. Instead, the wedding would not take place for nearly a full decade longer. It was finally solemnized at the Church of Our Lady in the town of Boulogne on the northern coast of France, overlooking the English Channel, on the 25th of January, 1308. By then, Edward was 23 years of age, while Isabella was nearing her teenage years, an age that was considered to be old enough for marriage in the 14th century. By then, Isabella was marrying a king rather than a prince. Edward I had died 6 months earlier, and her new husband had succeeded him as King Edward II. It would be a problematic union from the very beginning, as Edward was bisexual and tended to prefer the company of men, though he was not averse to women, and he sired an illegitimate son a few years before his marriage to Isabella. His preference for male company also extended to favouring certain male individuals at court and allowing them and their families and factions to rise to positions of great power and wealth, something which would fracture the political community in England during his 20-year reign, shaping Isabella's life as well, in many ways in the process. A prevailing myth concerning Isabella is her relationship with the Scottish rebel William Wallace. At the time that Isabella was first betrothed to Prince Edward, his father, King Edward I, had been involved in a long-running war with the Scottish, led by a number of prominent nobles and knights, including William Wallace. This was all part of England's constant attempts throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period to impose control over all of Britain, including Scotland. Edward had famously largely conquered Scotland in the mid-1290s, dragging the Stone of Scone, the inauguration stone used by Scottish kings, back to England in 1296 as a symbol of the destruction of Scottish independence. It was a temporary development, however, and the Scots were soon at war with England again. William Wallace was captured as part of this new rebellion in Glasgow in 1305 and was executed in August of that year at Smithfield in London. Isabella was around 10 years old at this time and was still living in France. The suggestion that she ever knew or had a relationship with Wallace is a complete invention, though England's relationship with Scotland and the conflicts between the two nations would feature prominently in the politics of her time as Queen of England. Almost as soon as Isabella arrived in England, despite her young age, she would have been aware of a growing concern at court and wider afield about the influence of one Piers Gaveston over her husband. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight from England's territories in western France, who King Edward I had assigned to his son and heir, Edward's household, in the early 1300s. The relationship soon became problematic as Gaveston's influence over the younger Edward grew and rumours flew about the court. Edward I exiled Piers from the court as a result in the mid-1300s, and then, after a brief rapprochement in 1306, ordered him to leave England entirely in 1307. Yet the old king's death just a few months later saw Gaveston being recalled, and the new king now promoted him to the title of Earl of Cornwall, while also granting him and friends and family members extensive lands and offices. All of this was creating immense unrest amongst the nobility of England, many of whom noted that the earldom of Cornwall had typically been reserved for a member of the royal family. This opposition included a faction led by the Earls of Warenne, Hereford, Pembroke and Lincoln, who, just weeks after Isabella arrived in England, urged Parliament to demand that Edward exile Gaveston yet again. The king relented, in large part because Isabella's father sent word from France that he was unhappy with news of this court favourite to whom Edward bestowed such favours, when his energies should have been on making his new wife feel at home in a foreign land. King Philip was no doubt especially dismayed to learn that when Edward and Isabella's joint coronation took place at Westminster Abbey near London, a month to the day after their marriage in northern France, Gaveston was central to the ceremony, being decked out elaborately and leading the king and queen through the main aisle of the abbey during the procession. Something clearly had to change, and Gaveston was exiled yet again, being sent off on this occasion to act as the king's lieutenant in the lordship of Ireland. Ireland was only a short boat ride away from Wales, and it was perhaps inevitable that Edward, who had been miserable when Gaveston left, conspired for Piers to return secretly in the summer of 1309. A fresh political storm followed in the months after this as it became known that Gaveston was back in England. For her part, Isabella was by then of an age to be able to fully appreciate some of the political nuances of what was happening, and also the difficult marital situation which her husband's relationship with the upstart was creating. This included the uncomfortable scenario in which Edward, Isabella and Piers ended up heading north to oversee a military campaign against the Scots, who were making incursions into northern England under their new leader, Robert Bruce, the aspirant to the throne of Scotland. Edward's decision to give Gaveston command over much of the campaign that followed was sufficient cause for the nobles to, yet again, call for his exile in 1311. A final departure and return to England was the limit of their patience. When he reappeared in England in 1312, a cohort of nobles led by the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick and Pembroke orchestrated to have him detained and killed that summer. Isabella must have breathed a sigh of relief, but there would soon be a new royal favourite and new problems, while the tensions between Edward and his nobles would continue virtually unabated for the next 15 years. Eventually, as she grew older and learned to look after her own interests, Isabella would move from being a bystander in these political intrigues to a major player herself. Isabella's relief at the death of Gaveston in the summer of 1312 was added to by the birth of her and Edward's first child just a few months later. Edward of Windsor was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle and was named after both his father and grandfather. Young Edward, like his mother, would have to grow up prematurely in his early teenage years as political events conspired around him. All of that was to come, though. In the interim, Isabella and Edward II had 3 further children, while suffering at least one miscarriage. Another boy, John, was born in 1316, solidifying the line of succession with 2 male heirs. 2 daughters then followed, Eleanor of Woodstock in the summer of 1318 and Joan in the summer of 1321, often referred to as Joan of the Tower, as her mother gave birth to her in the Tower of London, the city's great medieval and early modern fortress. Isabella was seemingly central to one of the more colourful episodes to occur at the French court in the early 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a guard tower of the old city walls of Paris. Each of her brothers had married into the nobility of Burgundy of eastern France, which, as we have seen, was a powerful rival to the French crown for dominance over large parts of the country, and would remain so for another century and a half. Her brother, Louis, for instance, married Margaret of Burgundy, the second daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. Philippe married Joan, the daughter of Count Otto IV of Burgundy. Finally, Joan's sister Blanche of Burgundy married Isabella's other brother, Charles. The affair has taken on a quasi-legendary aspect over the centuries. Rumour at the time had it that, on a major state visit to France in the summer of 1313, shortly after the Gaveston affair had seemed to bring a period of temporary peace to England, Isabella had sewn some purses for each of her brothers and her sisters-in-law. Not too long afterwards, at a social gathering at court, she noticed that two knights, Sir Gautier of Aunay and Sir Philippe of Aunay, were carrying the purses which she had embroidered for two of her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Margaret. Fearing that they were engaged in affairs with the two knights, Isabella relayed her concerns to her father. King Philip responded by having some of his spies monitor the two knights and his two daughters-in-law. The results of the investigations led to the conclusion that Blanche and Margaret had been engaged in infidelities, meeting the two knights at the Tour de Nesle Tower along the city walls. In the ensuing fallout, it was also concluded that while Philip's wife, Joan, had not been unfaithful to her husband, she had known of the affair her sister Blanche was engaged in and was complicit in a sense as a result. In the period that followed, both Blanche and Margaret were arrested and placed in prison, while Sir Gautier and Sir Philippe were executed for their role in what was a serious social and political embarrassment for the French royal family. Blanche and Margaret were placed on trial and subjected to a public humiliation by having their heads shaved. They were then sent to the Château Gaillard. Margaret died within a year, perhaps on the orders of her husband, who had become king after Isabella's father's death in November 1314, while Blanche remained imprisoned until her marriage was finally annulled in 1322, and her husband was free to marry again. Joan was eventually forgiven by her husband for her alleged role in covering up her sister and sister-in-law's actions. Isabella came out of the entire affair looking poorly to the French populace, who eventually felt sympathy for Margaret and Blanche's plight. The royal visit to France in the summer of 1313 was important in other ways. It was an episode which saw Isabella emerge for the first time as a significant power broker between England and France, and her entry into the world of high politics as she became what we would now deem to be a young woman. The occasion was the triple knighting of her three brothers, who would then knight hundreds of other Frenchmen in a grand royal occasion which symbolized the arrival of a new generation of French nobles and leaders. Days of celebrations occurred in which Edward and Isabella were often central. There was a formal event as well, in which many individuals, Isabella included, took the cross, the symbol of the Crusaders that had been worn since 1095 when the First Crusade began, though by 1313 the Crusader states in the Holy Land had all been conquered by the Islamic powers there. We get an insight into the foibles of royalty here, as one chronicler noted with some amusement that Edward and Isabella overslept for the ceremony of the taking of the cross. More seriously, negotiations followed in the days ahead in which King Philip, Isabella's father, assured Edward that he would have support from France if he needed it against his fractious nobles back in England. Isabella had seemingly been central to the diplomacy involved. Back in England, Isabella was soon learning that the murder of Gaveston had not brought an end to the domestic turmoil of her husband's realm. In the months prior to Gaveston's fall, the faction which was opposed to him had come to be controlled by Thomas, 2nd Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of Edward's, whose grandfather was King Henry III, and whose father, Edmund Crouchback, had been King Edward I's brother. Thomas also traced his ancestry on his mother's side back to the royal families of France and Navarre. This made Lancaster the most powerful noble in England, and he had been instrumental in Gaveston's downfall. After the favourite was murdered, there followed an uneasy reconciliation between him and the king, one in which it was made clear that Edward was a monarch whose power had been seriously undermined. The years that followed were consequently characterized by continuing political turmoil. compounded when the Scots won a major victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, gaining the upper hand in the Scottish War of Independence in the process. As Edward lay on the precipice of losing Scotland, which his father had largely completed the conquest of 20 years earlier, his standing in the eyes of his nobles plummeted even further. The years that followed were marked by a growing drift towards outright conflict yet again between Edward and his nobles. The instability was compounded by a major famine between 1315 and 1317, aroused by bad weather and the mass outbreak of a bovine disease which eviscerated cattle stocks across England. The Crown did nothing to assuage public opinion during this time by continuing its lavish spending, Isabella included, who had developed a habit of wasting large amounts of money on overt pomp and ceremony. When she had visited France without her husband in 1314, for instance, the expedition required 27 ships and 13 barges to transport all of her belongings and servants across the Channel. Such frivolous expense did not go unnoticed amongst her and Edward's subjects. Yet, as damaging as the famine of the mid-1310s, the loss to the Scots, and the Crown's profligate spending were, the issue which would spark another crisis and war was the King's continuing promotion of court favourites. For a time after Gaveston was murdered, the individual involved was Roger d'Amory, but he was soon displaced in the King's affections by Hugh Despencer the Younger, the son and heir of Hugh Despencer the Elder, Baron Despencer. As Despencer rose as a new version of Gaveston in the late 1310s, a Despencer faction emerged as well, with many individuals around him being given lands, titles, and offices by the king. The nobles were not impressed, and in May 1321, war broke out in England as a faction led by Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, 4th Earl of Hereford, and a former Lord Lieutenant of the English Lordship in Ireland, Roger Mortimer, emerged to challenge Edward and the Despensers. The Despencer War, as it is often termed, lasted for 10 months between May 1321 and March 1322. In its early stages, the alliance of anti-Despencer nobles had the better of it and converged on London. It was this military action which forced Isabella to take refuge in the Tower of London and so gave birth to her daughter Joan there. It was just weeks later that Isabella intervened, with Edward apparently going down on her knees before her husband and imploring him to expel Despencer from England in order to bring peace back to the country. Incredibly, Edward agreed to her request and commanded Hugh and his father to leave the country. However, Isabella was also central within weeks to the renewed outbreak of hostilities when, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, she was refused entry to and hospitality at Leeds Castle in Kent, an abode of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a lord who had sided with Lancaster and others against Edward just months earlier. The king took this rebuff of his wife as the excuse he needed to recommence the war, and within weeks the Despensers were back in England with fresh reinforcements. By the spring, it was all over, with Edward and the Despensers having won victory over Lancaster, Hereford, Mortimer, and their allies at the Battle of Borough Bridge on the 16th of March 1322. Whether Isabella was an oblivious pawn in Edward's machinations and he simply used the event at Leeds Castle as an excuse to resume hostilities, or whether her entire pilgrimage to Canterbury was a clever ploy which Isabella had been complicit in, remains a mystery to this day. Victory in the Despencer War saw Edward exact revenge for a decade of wrongs which he believed had been committed by his nobles. Hereford was killed in the fighting at Butter Bridge, seemingly dying in a particularly gruesome manner, his screams apparently dismaying his soldiers and contributing to the defeat. Lancaster was placed on trial, where a panel led by the Despensers refused to let him speak in his own defence and found him guilty. He was executed 6 days after Butter Bridge, while Mortimer was detained and sentenced to death. However, he would have his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower of London in what was a significant development for Isabella's future affairs. He escaped from the Tower in August 1323, and after a brief effort to raise a fresh revolt against the crown, fled to France. In the interim, the Despensers and their faction now had free rein to rule England as they wished. For his part, Edward began inflicting punishment on anyone who he perceived to have been responsible for Gaveston's murder back in 1312, and the undermining of his royal authority ever since. Dozens of lords and members of their families were placed in prison. Others were even less fortunate. Bartholomew de Badlesmere, the owner of Leeds Castle, where Isabella's being refused hospitality in the late autumn of 1321 had reignited the Despenser War, was dragged by a horse through the streets of Canterbury before being hanged and decapitated outside the town, his head placed on a pike overlooking anyone who entered or left the Kentish religious centre as a symbol of Edward's newfound power and tyranny. If Edward believed in the mid-1320s, in the aftermath of the Despenser War, that he was finally free from opposition and could rule as much as he pleased, he would soon find out that he was wrong. And with Lancaster, Hereford, and many of his other opponents dead, the opposition would now come from a different, unexpected source: his wife. There were multiple reasons for her growing alienation. In late 1322, she was placed in danger while in northern England when her husband failed to respond quickly enough to a Scottish incursion into the north of the country. More worryingly, in January 1322, Isabella's brother Charles had ascended to the throne of France as King Charles IV. Over the next year or so, relations between England and France deteriorated over a number of issues, of which Edward's position as Duke of Aquitaine in western France was central. As this occurred, the Despensers began targeting Isabella herself and her large number of French staff, many of whom had lived with her in England since her arrival in 1308. In all, 27 of her household staff were removed and arrested on the grounds of being French, as well as her chaplain and personal physician. The Queen was also stripped of most of her personal lands, and her household budget was drastically reduced. The final straw was when the Despensers removed her 3 younger children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, from her custody and entrusted their upbringing to Hugh Despenser's wife and sister. All of these attacks on her would combine to lead Isabella to begin plotting her own assault on the Despensers and her husband from the mid-1320s onwards. The opportunity she had been looking for came when she was sent as an envoy to France in March 1325. Isabella was dispatched across the Channel with a large retinue of staff who were loyal to Edward and the Despensers, her instructions being to negotiate peace terms in the war which had erupted between England and France, and then to return so that Edward could finally settle the war with the Scots without fear of French intervention. She was determined to act differently. Over a period of several months of negotiation in France, she moved the debate to concentrate on whether or not her husband, as Duke of Aquitaine, would come to France to pay homage to her brother, who, as King of France, was theoretically Edward's liege lord. Edward was unwilling to do this, but in response, Isabella proposed an alternative solution in the early autumn of 1325. If her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, was sent to France, Charles would accept him paying homage as the basis for peace without his father, King Edward II, having to do so. Such a neat solution was quickly accepted, and Prince Edward, who was conveniently in southern England at the time, was conveyed across the Channel to his mother. King Edward and the Despensers had fallen for the trap. With Prince Edward, the eldest son and heir to the Kingdom of England, now in Isabella's custody and the safety of her brother's French dominions, she was in a position to launch her own campaign against her husband and the Despensers. Isabella's actions in the autumn of 1325 were compounded in the months that followed by her developing liaison with Roger Mortimer, one of the leaders of the opposition to the crown during the Despenser War, who had subsequently been imprisoned and then escaped from the Tower of London. There is no evidence to indicate, as some historians of the 19th century attempted to argue, that Isabella helped Mortimer escape from the Tower back in 1323 before he fled to France. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in France, in late 1325, she began meeting with Mortimer, who had become the de facto head of an anti-crown and anti-Despenser party of English exiles in Paris. The relationship became sexual towards the end of 1325. Isabella must have been aware how risky all of her behavior now was. After all, 2 of her sisters-in-law had been placed on trial and imprisoned over a decade earlier during the Tour de Nesle affair, owing to their infidelities. The affair she now began with Mortimer was to be one of the most colourful in the history of medieval Europe, one which burned brightly for half a decade and impacted hugely on England's politics, while also transgressing deeply held ideas of the time concerning matrimony and patriarchy. A more colourful description might suggest that they were somewhat like a medieval royal Bonnie and Clyde. By early 1326, with Prince Edward in their custody and a growing amount of financial and military support being provided by Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, Isabella and Mortimer were ready to make their move against her erstwhile husband and the Despensers. On the 22nd of September 1326, with a small flotilla of ships and men, she set sail for England. Ships mainly provided by Count Guillaume of Hainaut, whose daughter Philippa, Isabella had promised her son Prince Edward would marry in return for his support. They landed on the coast of Suffolk in East Anglia 2 days later. In the days that followed, the unpopular and tyrannical regime of Edward and the Despensers collapsed, as leading nobles and lords abandoned the crown and sided with the small army of invaders from France led by Isabella and Mortimer. Calls for troops to muster in defence of the government were ignored, while towns and cities such as Cambridge opened their gates to the small army from France. By early October, as Isabella and Mortimer moved towards London, Edward fled from the capital towards the West Midlands and then into Wales. On the 16th of November, the invasion culminated in its great success when Edward and Despenser were captured in southern Wales. Edward's fate would wait for later, but 8 days later Despenser was found guilty in a perfunctory trial, following which he was hung from the city walls of Hereford before being disemboweled and castrated while still alive, the ordeal of being hanged, drawn and quartered, only coming to an end when the executioner beheaded him. Despenser was dead, and Isabella and Mortimer were in charge of England. But there was still the somewhat tricky matter of the king, who was still alive and also married to Isabella. Initially, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Monmouth Castle. In the weeks thereafter, Isabella's advisers devised an ingenious way of dispensing with him. Edward had briefly taken ship in the Irish Sea in the desperate days before he was captured. He had been forced to land in Wales, but the incident was now used to deploy an argument that in abandoning his kingdom, Edward had abdicated his crown. The logic followed that when he did so, Isabella and his eldest child, Prince Edward, succeeded him as King Edward III. Thus was the 14-year-old Edward installed as king in January 1327, though with Isabella and Mortimer now heading up a regency government on his behalf during his minority. They would be the real power behind the throne for years to come. The deposed king was moved to Berkeley Castle in the spring of 1327. He was, apparently, well treated there in his imprisonment for the next several months. That is, until the 21st of September, when he was almost certainly discreetly murdered on Mortimer and Isabella's orders. Isabella and Mortimer were received in England when they arrived from France in the autumn of 1326 as saviours from the quasi-tyranny of Edward II and the Despenser faction. However, many people soon realized that they had simply swapped one form of irresponsible kleptocracy and heavy-handed rule for another. In particular, the land grab which Isabella and Mortimer engaged in the course of 1327 and 1328 was incredible. Isabella had her dower lands, which had been stripped from her back in 1323, returned to her, but in addition, she seized huge estates which made her wealthier than any magnate had been in England for decades, with an annual rental from her lands across England and Wales that exceeded, by a considerable margin, those that Thomas of Lancaster, the greatest noble in the kingdom during much of Edward II's reign, had controlled. She also seized half a dozen prominent castles across England, notably Bristol Castle and Pontefract. She'd go on to drain the exchequer of any remaining funds, some admittedly to pay off her soldiers, but others to finance her own largesse in the years ahead. The behaviour was echoed by Mortimer, who quickly seized vast estates across southern Wales and the English West Midlands, proclaiming himself as the Earl of March in tandem to symbolise his preponderant position in the March or border region between England and Wales. All of this very quickly saw public sentiment towards Isabella and Mortimer shift. A regency council which included many of the leading nobles who had survived the purges of the Despenser period and the overthrow of Edward II had been established to govern the country until such time as Edward III was of an age to rule himself. It was revealed within months, however, that Isabella and Mortimer considered this to be merely a piece of window dressing to legitimize what was effectively rule by Isabella and her lover, who could not even marry each other after Edward II was killed, because Mortimer was still married to Joan de Joinville, with whom he had had a dozen children over the years. What created a scenario in which their regency became untenable were events in Scotland. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer agreed to end the interminable war which had been underway between England and Scotland for decades by agreeing to recognise an independent Scotland with Robert Bruce as its king. To cement the alliance, Isabella offered for her youngest daughter, Joan of the Tower, to marry Bruce's son and heir, 4-year-old David, thus cementing a new rapprochement with the Scots. But while Isabella and Mortimer deemed this to be a good end to the conflict with the Scots, young King Edward III, who was now nearing his 16th birthday, considered it to be a humiliation and the abdication of much of his birthright. From this juncture, he was plotting to overthrow his mother and her lover and begin to rule in their place. The young king did not move immediately. His reticence was brought about by the failure of a rebellion in early 1329 by the 3rd Earl of Lancaster, a close cousin of the king's and the brother of the 2nd Earl of Lancaster, who was executed at the end of the Despencer War back in 1322. Lancaster had allied with several prominent nobles to overthrow Mortimer and Isabella, yet had been outflanked by their armies when he moved on London. He surrendered and was neutralized as a threat. The entire episode served as a warning to Edward III, and his household was filled with staff loyal to his mother and Mortimer. What finally brought matters to a head was the execution, in March 1330, of the Earl of Kent, a younger son of King Edward I and Edward III's half-uncle. The political realm was shocked by this transgression, and Lancaster now implored Edward to act, which he did. In mid-October 1330, he and his conspirators surrounded Isabella and Mortimer with their retinue at Nottingham Castle. Both were detained, and Edward finally affirmed his decision to begin ruling in his own stead on the cusp of his 18th birthday. 6 weeks later, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn in London. Isabella had pleaded for his life to be spared. Her son had refused to listen. Isabella was placed under house arrest following the fall of her and Mortimer from power and her lover's execution. Her detention was at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire to begin with for several weeks, before she was moved to Windsor Castle shortly before Christmas 1330 in what was evidently a relaxing of her conditions, as she was placed closer to where her son would have contact with her. During these months, there were clearly conversations had with her about how she could be reconciled to the new situation and rehabilitated. The story which would be presented going forward was that Isabella had been led astray by the malevolent Mortimer and as a result had temporarily failed to live in a manner which lived up to her responsibilities towards her son as King of England. As these negotiations were underway, she was also mourning Mortimer, and such was her emotional state that more than one historian has concluded that she suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind during these months. Eventually, she recovered, and ever a realist and pragmatist when it came to politics, she agreed to the new narrative which had been decided upon. Since she had arrived in England 22 years earlier as a child to marry Edward II, she had learned to survive on her wits. And the circumstances she found herself in now in the early 1330s, still some way shy of her 40th year, was no different. Satisfied that she posed no further threat to her son's reign, the decision was taken to set her free in 1332. While Isabella was free from 1332 onwards, there was no doubt at all that her political life was at a virtual end. The vast lands that she had accumulated from late 1326 onwards were surrendered to the Crown back at the end of 1330, but Edward now granted her Castle Rising in Norfolk and East Anglia, where she would live in her retirement. He was more than generous, allotting her a pension of £3,000 a year as well, a fortune in 14th century terms. Despite a belief in the past that Isabella was in semi-exile here, this was certainly not the case. She was regularly visited over the years by leading nobles calling to see the Queen Dowager and the mother of the king, while Edward III called on occasion too, during which Castle Rising was transformed into the centre of the political world in England as the royal court relocated here. Over time, she became a doting grandmother, as the marriage between her son and Philippa of Hainaut, which she had negotiated back in 1326, resulted in a large brood of children from the birth of a new Edward, the Black Prince, in 1330, with many more following over the 1330s and into the 1340s. Over time, she was also welcomed back to the royal court at Windsor or in London on occasion. In many ways, it was the attainment of much of what she had always sought: comfort and stability, the very things which her husband's tumultuous reign had deprived her of from her teenage years onwards, and which she had begun her relationship with Mortimer in pursuit of. Isabella was able to play a slight role in political affairs in her long retirement, owing to events in France. Back in 1328, while she and Mortimer were effectively ruling England in the name of her son, Isabella's brother Charles died, the third and last of her brothers to die in quick succession after Louis in 1316, who seems to have succumbed to pleurisy, and Philippe in 1322. Although Louis had a son, he died in infancy after spending just 5 days on the throne himself in 1316, while both Philippe and Charles died without a male heir. Furthermore, the Salic law in France forbade a woman from becoming queen regnant, unlike in England. This opened up the possibility of Edward III having a legitimate claim to the French throne on account of his being the son of Isabella and the grandson of King Philippe the Fair. However, at a meeting of the French nobles shortly after Charles's death, it was determined that Philippe, Count of Valois, would succeed as King Philippe VI and start a new royal line. This dispensation held firm for nearly a decade. However, in 1337, England and France ended up at war after Philippe attempted to confiscate a chunk of England's remaining lands in western France around Gascony and the county of Ponthieu. With this, Edward went to war with the French. And not only that, but he decided to press his claim to the throne of France, which had been passed over in 1328. It was the beginning of what would be the 100 Years' War between England and France, as successive English monarchs tried to resurrect the Angevin Empire of the 12th century, when England had ruled much of France. As the woman through whom Edward based his claim to the French throne, and as one of the only senior surviving members of the royal house of Capet, Isabella suddenly had a new political significance from the late 1330s onwards. The 100 Years' War is generally divided into several distinct phases, in some of which England's fortunes were buoyant, while in others France gained the upper hand. The first phase lasted from the outbreak of the war in 1337 down to 1360, and was, generally, one in which England had the better of the fighting, particularly in the mid to late 1340s, when Edward led campaigns to France and won major strategic victories at the battles of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Calais the following year. With this, peace negotiations in which it was assumed the French would make considerable concessions to Edward were commenced. At this juncture, there was a proposal that Isabella, with her French heritage, would possibly be sent to France to negotiate on behalf of her son, whose claim to the French throne was based on Isabella being the last surviving child of King Philippe the Fair. Yet the outbreak of the Black Death, the worst first wave of the bubonic plague across Europe, scuppered the planned diplomatic mission and stalled affairs in the wider war thereafter for several years. It was not until 1356 that a major breakthrough was made again when Edward won another significant victory at the Battle of Poitiers, where King John II of France was captured. Following this, Isabella was involved in English negotiations with Charles II, King of Navarre, whose dominions lay to the south of the English possessions in Aquitaine in southwestern France, and who was a relative of Isabella's, his grandfather having been King Louis X of France, Isabella's brother. Charles was aiming to claim the French throne himself after King John was captured at Poitiers, though he failed in this, and whatever Isabella's intervention with him might have achieved, it could not stop Charles constantly switching sides in the wider conflict between France and England. The diplomatic mission to Charles of Navarre was one of the last actions of Isabella's life. She appeared at Windsor Castle, which her son had expanded dramatically to make the finest royal castle in England, for the St. George's Day celebrations there on the 23rd of April 1358, and was noted for the riches of her dress, which purportedly was inlaid with hundreds of precious gemstones, such as rubies, and upwards of 2,000 pearls. This ostentatious display of wealth was somewhat in contrast to her decision just a few weeks later to take the nun's habit of the Poor Clares, or Order of St. Clare, a monastic order founded centuries earlier by St. Clare of Assisi, one of St. Francis's first followers. She had been ill for several months and must have been aware, when she made this decision, that her life was coming to an end. Isabella died on the 22nd of August 1358, most likely at 63 or so years of age. A longer than usual delay followed before her funeral was finally held on the 27th of November 1358. Although it had already become a tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster Abbey by this time, this did not necessarily extend to queen consorts, and so Isabella was interred at the Greyfriars Church in London alongside her aunt, Queen Marguerite, Edward I's second wife, and the same king's mother, Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III. There, she was laid to rest with the clothes she had worn as a child on the cusp of her teenager years the day she married Edward II, half a century earlier, draped over her. Her daughter, Joan of the Tower, was buried there as well 4 years later. Many of those who might have looked at Isabella as a malevolent figure who had extended the instability wrought by Edward II's reign beyond 1326 may have looked to the future as potentially being a more favourable time for England. And it must be said that for a time in the middle of the 14th century under her son, the kingdom's fortunes did markedly improve, as England had the better of the opening stages of the 100 Years' War. But they would soon have been disabused of this notion in the period following Isabella's death. England's problem, it transpired, did not lie with the former queen, but within the wider politics of the realm. Edward's grandson, King Richard II, presided over a period from his accession in the late 1370s, in which renewed unrest between England's nobles and the crown broke out. It ebbed and flowed until he was overthrown and killed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Isabella's great-grandson, in 1399. And this only led to a period of vague stability until the middle of the 15th century, when a new civil war, the Wars of the Roses, erupted again. Isabella and Mortimer, it turned out, were symptoms of the political instability which constantly pitted the crown against the nobles in late medieval England, not the cause of it. Isabella of France has a reputation as one of the most formidable female figures of English history, being termed a she-wolf in two eminent early 21st century studies of her life. But if she became a she-wolf over time, she certainly did not arrive in England as one. Instead, she was a child being married off to an adult male in a foreign land for the sake of political expediency. Then, as she grew up, she learned that her husband was a ruler who was seemingly intent on choosing favourites at his court in ways which antagonized the majority of the political community. There was constant instability around her and war with foreign enemies. In this environment, she had to adapt and became ruthless herself in trying to promote her own interests in a situation where she knew her husband would not. It was this situation which led to her eventually beginning her relationship with Mortimer and overthrowing her own husband. She was badly regarded for centuries as a result, a development which simply points towards a latent misogyny in assessing the actions of a woman who was deemed to have broken the natural laws of matrimony. Many historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that she destabilized England as a result. But in reality, the conflicts of the 1320s were merely few amongst many which characterized the English crown's relationship with the wider political community between the 12th and 17th centuries. Ultimately, if Isabella was ruthless, it was in response to finding herself in this politically volatile environment at such a young and vulnerable age. What do you think of Isabella of France? Was she a malevolent schemer who destabilized England, or was she simply a woman who, having been cast into the maelstrom of English politics as a child, learned to survive as best she could? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Edward II was born on the 25th of April 1284 at Carnarvon Castle in northwestern Wales. Edward was born on the feast day of St. Mark the Evangelist, and at birth was given the title Lord Edward of Carnarvon. He was the fourth son of his father, King Edward I, after whom he was named, who himself was named after his father King Henry's favourite saint, Edward the Confessor. Edward's Spanish mother, Queen Eleanor of Castile, was 42 when she gave birth to Edward, her youngest child. She was born in 1241, the daughter of King Fernando III of Castile and Leon, who was later canonized as San Fernando. Despite the great celebrations on his arrival, Edward was not born an heir. As his elder brother Alfonso was alive when Edward was born, however, Alfonso unfortunately came to an untimely end on the 19th of August 1284 at the age of 10, when Edward was only 4 months old, making Edward heir to the throne of England, although he would not be made Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester until the 7th of February 1301, and he received the Duchy of Aquitaine from his father on the 7th of April 1306, just 6 weeks before he was knighted at Westminster Abbey. Two other sons of King Edward I and Queen Eleanor, John and Henry, had died at the ages of 5 and 6 in 1271 and 1274 respectively, making the only remaining son precious indeed. But Lord Edward was a hardy child who only suffered from one reported illness during his childhood, which was a tertian fever shortly after he turned 10 years of age. King Edward I and Queen Eleanor also had 10 daughters, only 5 of whom survived to adulthood. Lord Edward was born in Wales a year after his father had conquered the region, and he would leave Wales at just a few months old and would not return until shortly before his 17th birthday in April 1301. Furthermore, at the time of his birth, Lord Edward was proclaimed a great portent or omen of a great or significant happening. Some said that the end of the world was near and that Edward would be a latter-day King Arthur, leading England to great glory. The first great loss that Edward II experienced was at the age of 6, with the death of his mother Eleanor on the 28th of November 1290. It was said that King Edward I grieved greatly for his queen, building the Eleanor crosses in her memory, which were crosses built at the 12 places that the Queen's funeral procession had stopped on the way to Westminster, and it was on Queen Eleanor's death that 6-year-old Edward inherited the title Count of Ponthieu from her. 7 months later, Edward would also lose his paternal grandmother, Eleanor of Provence, widow of Henry III, and it could be said that the lack of a guiding maternal figure in Edward's young life may have affected him emotionally in later life. But Edward was not completely without female care, as he was looked after by a wet nurse as a baby called Mary or Mariotta Monsell, who would later be replaced by Alice de Lagrave when Mary became ill. Young Edward would not have had much contact in his early years with his natural mother Eleanor, as she would be away in the Duchy of Aquitaine with Edward's father for much of his infancy, and so Edward was cared for as a baby by employees of the king under the direction of a clerk named Giles of Oudenarde, and later, as he grew, he would be educated by Dominican friars and his tutor, Sir Guy Fawkes. During his early years, Edward would spend the winters at Langley, near St Albans, and during the summer he would tour around the south of England and the Midlands with his entourage in tow, and the meals and horse care his party needed would often put a burden on the local townsfolk due to the party's numbers. As well as a large staff, Edward also had the companionship of several children of high birth, who were recorded as part of his household during the 1290s, such as Maud Chaworth, granddaughter of the Earl of Warwick, Eleanor de Burgh, eldest daughter of the Earl of Ulster, and Humphrey de Bohun, heir to the earldom of Hereford, and, in the early 1300s, the nephew of the Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare, who was Lord of Thomond in Ireland. Hugh de Spencer, when he was a boy, and Piers Gaveston, a noble from France, were also part of his household, and indeed Piers Gaveston was originally a squire in Edward I's household and was recorded in the records by the nickname Perrot. Physically, Edward II was a striking figure. He was kingly, tall and handsome, lacking his father's lisp or his grandfather Henry III's drooping eye. He was elegant and strong, and his fair curly hair fell almost to his shoulders and was parted in the middle. He also wore a moustache and a beard, and when he came to the throne, he was seen at first as a breath of fresh air. After the long 35-year reign of his father, he was athletic, a good horseman like his father, and popular at first. But public opinion was soon to change when knowledge of his strange pastimes became known. Edward would swim, row, and dig ditches, gamble, and even thatch roofs. He was also not fond of warfare, and he did not like to hold tournaments. Some thought his unkingly behaviour indicated that this man was not suited or indeed happy with his lot as King of England, and would not live up to his father's reputation. The chronicler Ranulph Higden claimed that Edward preferred the company of jesters, carriage drivers, diggers, and sailors to the company of knights, and indeed there are records of dinner guests of Edward's that include sailors, barge masters, and carpenters. It is true that Edward II's reputation with his people and with the nobles at court and even with his own father would suffer from his pursuit of unsuitable pastimes, and also his seeming obsession with unsuitable favourites, whom he would shower with privileges. The first, and perhaps most famous of Edward's favourites, was the son of Arnaud de Gabaston, a Gascon knight and vassal to Edward I in his role as Duke of Aquitaine, who served with Edward I during the Welsh Wars of 1282 to 1283. The son's name was Piers Gaveston. It was Edward I who initially sent Piers Gaveston to live in his son's household when Edward was just 16, as he had impressed Edward I with his military prowess when he served in his army in Flanders in 1297 and also in Scotland in 1300. It is thought that Edward I placed Gaveston in his son's household to act as a role model, as he was an excellent jouster, brilliant soldier, and was very courageous, and according to the chronicler Geoffrey Baker, he was agile in body and also graceful, refined, and well versed in military matters. In 1304, at the request of young Edward, the king gave Gaveston the wardship of Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, after the death of his father. This act showed that the king had confidence in his son's companion at that time, as he would have charge of Mortimer's possessions until the child came of age. Piers Gaveston was of noble birth, his family being from the village of Gabaston, close to the Pyrenees, from which the family took their name. He is thought to have been older than Edward, a flamboyant character who was a member of Edward I's household from November 1297. However, by 1303, Gaveston was described as Edward II's companion, and Edward was known to show him great affection in public, and indeed it was blatant that Edward loved the man. But whether it was a brotherly love or some deeper sexual attraction is a subject of debate among scholars. One school of thought suggests that despite the great love Edward II had for Piers Gaveston, it was not necessarily a romantic love as we know it today, as the bonds of love and brotherhood between men were common during this time, and indeed at the time Edward referred to Gaveston as our dear and faithful brother, and one chronicle calls him a great earl whom the king had adopted as a brother, and the French historian Pierre Chaplet suggested that the relationship might have been one of adoptive brotherhood, in which each participant pledges support to the other as if they were brothers. It is indisputable that Gaveston did hold great influence over Edward. However, the idea that their relationship was sexual was largely due to the play of 1592 by Christopher Marlowe called Edward II. But the words of an anonymous chronicler from the 1320s have also been interpreted as suggestive of a sexual element to their relationship, although the words used, such as indissoluble love, covenant of constancy, and fastened with a knot, do not suggest sexual overtones at all, but are quite vague, and indeed it was the case at the time that sodomy was a heresy and was condemned by the Church in 14th century England, so it was not something that Edward, either as heir to the crown or indeed as king, would have undertaken lightly. The first blatant reference to homosexuality came in 1334, when the Bishop of Winchester, Adam Orleton, was accused of saying that Edward was a sodomite, but he later defended himself by saying that he had in fact been referring to Hugh Despenser the Younger, and not the late king himself. It has also been suggested that the comments were in large part politically motivated. After this, in the 1390s, the Moe Chronicle noted that Edward gave himself, quote, too much to the vice of sodomy, but it has been suggested that such allegations may have been influenced by Orleton's original comment, which was later retracted. In fact, both Gaveston and Edward II had sexual relationships with their wives and fathered children with them, and Edward also fathered an illegitimate son, Adam, at some time between 1305 and 1310, when he was in his 20s, and was also said to have had an affair with his niece, Eleanor de Clare. Furthermore, historians such as Seymour Phillips and Michael Prestwich make the point that the public nature of the English royal court would have made keeping a homosexual affair secret almost impossible. It is also the case that the church at the time, as well as Edward's father and father-in-law, made no known critical comments about Edward's sex life. Although the exact nature of the relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveston is uncertain, it is known that the favouritism shown to Gaveston caused widespread resentment and jealousy throughout the kingdom, not least because of the arrogance that Gaveston was said to have shown, and this fact was not lost on the king, who perhaps felt that the actions of his young heir would only serve to anger his nobles. In 1259, King Henry III and Louis IX had signed the Treaty of Paris, which stated that lands in France owned by the English, such as Gascony, were held by the English kings as a vassal to France, and that the English kings had to pay homage to each new French king as their feudal overlord for holding these lands. Whenever a new king of either country was crowned, the English kings found this practice demeaning, and the French kings resented the English kings holding so much land in France. As part of the Treaty of Paris, failure to pay homage to the King of France in a timely manner would lead to the confiscation of the held lands, and indeed, Philip IV did seize Gascony from Edward I in 1294, when Edward refused to travel to Paris to discuss an incident at the port of La Rochelle, and so in August 1297, Edward I left England on a campaign against the French and Philip IV in Flanders to defend his territory in Gascony, which had been occupied by the French king's forces. Edward II, who was only 13 at the time, was left behind and made regent in the king's absence, but this was not an easy time for Edward to be regent, as during that same year William Wallace had defeated the English at Stirling Bridge, and there was also great disagreement between Edward I and the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford, which made it an unsettled time in England. The outcome of the French campaign for Edward I was the peace treaty he signed with King Philip IV, which outlined an agreement whereby King Edward I, whose first wife Eleanor had died in 1290, would marry Philip's half-sister Margaret, whilst his son would marry Philip's daughter Isabella at some point in the future, as, at the time, she was just an infant. This agreement gave the English monarchy the key territory of Guyenne, as well as ensuring the return of Eleanor of Castile's lands in Ponthieu and Montreuil. But more importantly, it would ensure that a descendant of both kings would rule the Duchy of Gascony in the future and so prevent further conflict. Edward I's marriage to Margaret produced two stepbrothers for young Edward, Thomas of Brotherton and Edmund of Woodstock in 1300 and 1301, and the relationship between the extended step-family and Edward was seemingly cordial, as when he was later crowned king, Edward would provide his two step-brothers with both income and titles. In 1300, when Edward I returned to Scotland as part of his ongoing campaign, he took young Edward along, making him commander of the rear guard at the siege of Carlaverock, and on the 7th of February 1301, the king made Edward Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester, granting him extensive lands across North Wales in an attempt not only to give Edward his own income, but also to help pacify the region. Edward also joined the king on the campaign of 1301 in Scotland, which saw him capture Turnberry Castle, and in 1303 he used his own siege engine to besiege Brechin Castle, and in the spring of 1304 He took part in peace negotiations on behalf of his father with the Scottish rebels, but when no agreement was found, he joined his father once more for the siege of Stirling Castle. The year 1305 was marked by a quarrel that young Prince Edward had with Walter Langton, the royal treasurer, over the amount of money Edward received from the crown. His father sided with the treasurer, and Edward and his companions were banished from court, and his financial support was curtailed. However, the rift didn't last long, and father and son were soon reconciled. In 1306, Edward I had been greatly angered by the actions of his former ally, Robert the Bruce, including his crowning at Scone Abbey as King of Scotland and his stabbing to death of his great enemy, John the Red Comyn, in the Franciscan Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Prior to the crowning of Robert the Bruce, there had been a 10-year interregnum in Scotland, from when the previous King John Balliol had been removed from the throne in 1296, and whilst the English kings of the time did not lay claim to the Scottish throne, they did feel entitled to interfere in Scottish affairs, and they also believed that the Scottish kings owed fealty or loyalty to the kings of England in return for the kingdom they ruled. Both Edward I and Edward II would not recognise Robert the Bruce as King of the Scots, and the same was true of the Pope, because of Bruce's killing of John Comyn on sacred ground, and much of Edward II's reign would be marked by constant campaigns to defeat Robert the Bruce and claim his position as overlord of Scotland. And so, on the 7th of April 1306, when King Edward I made his son Duke of Aquitaine, his intention was for Edward to lead the campaign against Robert the Bruce and finally quash the Scottish rebels. Edward II was knighted by his father on the 22nd of May 1306 in Westminster Palace, and he then, in turn, knighted 300 other young men in Westminster Abbey. This ceremony became known as the Feast of the Swans, since Edward had a pair of golden swans brought before the gathering, and after the meal Edward would also swear an oath at this gathering that he would not sleep 2 nights in one place until the Scots had been defeated. Listening to Edward's promise were Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer, the Earls of Surrey and Arundel, and also there was Roger Mortimer, who was to play a great part in Edward II's downfall 20 years later. During this time, Edward's extravagant gestures towards Gaveston continued. One example would be the incident recorded by Walter of Guisborough, who recounts that in 1307 Edward told his father the king of his intention to give his favourite Piers Gaveston the title of Count of Ponthieu, which Edward had inherited from his mother, Eleanor of Castile, on her death. This reportedly caused the king to fly into a rage and defame Edward and even to lay hands on him, possibly saying that he would not have Edward inherit his lands would it not split the kingdom. It is also thought that Piers Gaveston may have been involved in an argument that Edward II had with the treasurer Walter Langton in 1305, following which Gaveston and Edward had been banished from court. However, the incident of 1307 was deemed much more serious by the king, as it resulted in him sending Gaveston into exile on the continent from the 30th of April 1307. But the exile was more of a punishment for Edward rather than Gaveston himself, and even though he was looked after financially by Edward I, as he gave him a dowry of 100 marks a year while he was absent, young Edward, generous as ever, made sure that Gaveston left the kingdom with horses, luxurious clothes, as well as £260. The Scala Chronica states that the reason for Gaveston's banishment in 1307 was that he was, quote, accused before the king of diverse crimes and vices which rendered him unfit company for the king's son. But It is likely that the real reason he was seen as unfit company was because of Edward's love and favouritism towards him, which the king felt might cause resentment amongst the nobles when Edward became king himself. Indeed, while his father lay dying in Burr-by-Sands, it was recorded by one chronicler that he gathered his nobles around him and instructed them to take care of young Edward, but also to prevent the return from exile of Gaveston. These nobles included Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, and Aymer de Valence, who would later become the Earl of Pembroke. Edward II's reign would be marked by controversy concerning the exact nature of his relationship with Piers Gaveston, but also because of his blatant favouritism. Indeed, following his father's death, Edward immediately recalled Gaveston from the exile in France that King Edward I had sent him to, despite knowing that it was against his father's wishes. This first act as king would come to typify his political naivety, as would his favouritism to male followers during his reign, which greatly antagonized the great earls, just as his father had feared. King Edward I died at the age of 68 on the 7th of July 1307 in Burr-by-Sands, on his way once again, accompanied by a large army, to confront Robert the Bruce. He died with Scotland's borders within sight, but whilst his son, and now the new King Edward II, had been on his way to join his father, he had decided to stop and turn back when he reached Northampton, and he sent his father 2 barrels of expensive sturgeon in his place. However, on hearing the news that his father had died, Edward II left London and started the march north to Carlisle. On the 23rd of July, Edward oversaw the departure of his father's funeral procession for London and Westminster Abbey, led by the Bishop of Durham, Anthony Beck, and Edward then set off on the 30-mile march to Dumfries with the aim of hunting down Robert the Bruce and also meeting up with his favourite Piers Gaveston, which he did when he arrived in Dumfries in August, and it was speculated that this would have been an emotional meeting due to the fact that Edward, by this time, loved Gaveston deeply and hadn't seen him since April. Edward II had inherited the earldom of Cornwall from his father, who in turn had inherited it from the childless Earl Edmund, nephew of Henry III, but on the 6th of August 1307, just a month after his father's death, Edward passed it on to his favourite Piers Gaveston, again, much to the annoyance of the earls, who were forced to put their seals to the charter, which is today housed in the National Archives in Kew, and only one dissenting earl refused to sign the charter. That was the Earl of Warwick. The Earldom of Cornwall had been one of the great titles of the Plantagenet era, and included lands in the southwest as well as Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Yorkshire, with an income of around £4,000 per year, and not only did Edward bestow this title on Gaveston, who the earls saw as unworthy, but he also promised him the hand in marriage of Margaret de Clare, the daughter of the powerful Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester, and Joan of Acre, Edward's sister. However, this act, which many saw as overly generous and inappropriate for a person of Gaveston's low standing, would also be a decision that would ultimately prove dangerous politically for Edward, as his love and favour for Gaveston was an indisputable fact, as was the gulf between their backgrounds, which was large, and these indignities and injustices greatly angered the earls, but it was also frowned upon by Edward I's second wife, Margaret of France, who had hopes that the title would have gone to one of her sons and Edward's half-brothers, Thomas of Brotherton or Edmund of Woodstock. Whilst still in Dumfries in 1307, after the death of Edward I, the Scottish lords loyal to Edward II paid homage to him, and then, on the 12th of August, Edward started the march north to pursue Robert the Bruce, accompanied by Gaveston, but After passing through Sanquhar to reach Cumnock in the southern territories of Scotland, it seemed that nothing of any value was being achieved, and so they marched south again to Carlisle, and then on to Knaresborough Castle in Yorkshire, which was now owned by Gaveston. Edward had inherited debts of some £200,000 from his father's reign when he came to the throne, but a good king should have been able to refinance and cope with this deficit, and one of the greater challenges left to Edward II by his father was the critical issue of the extent of English control in Scotland, as Edward I's long military campaign against the Scots and his issues with Robert the Bruce had not been concluded before his death. Whilst some chroniclers at the time claimed that the new king abandoned the campaign in Scotland in 1307, as he was eager to return south to marry his young fiancée Isabella, it was probably more likely that he wanted to return to take over the running of his father's government and make the necessary arrangements both for his wedding in France and, more importantly, his own coronation. And so it was that Edward II abandoned the war in Scotland in August 1307 and marched south, firstly to Yorkshire, and then on to Nottingham in September, and then to Northampton in October, where he would hold his first parliament in order to make the necessary arrangements for his father's funeral and for his coronation and wedding to Isabella of France, which took place in January 1308 in Boulogne. Edward II was betrothed 4 times during his childhood. The first time was to Margaret, the Maid of Norway, his cousin and daughter of Eric II of Norway and granddaughter of Alexander III of Scotland, who, on Alexander's death in 1286, became Queen of Scotland, but a marriage between her and Edward II would never happen, as in September 1290 she died at the age of only 7. His second betrothal was in 1291, when Edward was 7, and was to Blanche, a half-sister of Philip IV of France, but following the war that ensued between Edward I and Philip IV, the engagement was called off, and Edward was then betrothed to Philippa, daughter of the Count of Flanders, who was Edward I's ally, but this betrothal was ended when, in 1297, Edward I and Philip IV made peace. However, it was the betrothal that took place in 1299 to Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, which was the one that ended in marriage for Edward II. The funeral of Edward I took place at Westminster Abbey on the 27th of October 1307, where he was buried close to both his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, and his father, Henry III, in the chapel of Edward the Confessor. Following his father's funeral, Edward published an edict which stated that Gaveston should henceforth be addressed only by his title as Earl of Cornwall, which was intended to force the nobility to accept him as their equal and show him due respect. He also wanted Gaveston to be part of his royal family, so he made sure that the promise of marriage for Piers Gaveston to Edward's niece, Margaret de Clare, was kept. And so, in November 1307, only 5 days after Edward I's funeral, Piers Gaveston married Margaret de Clare, Edward II's niece, daughter of Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester and Joan of Acre. Edward's own sister, his niece Margaret, was only 13 at that time, and Gaveston was in his mid-20s. Gaveston held a jousting tournament in honour of his new bride, at which his knights defeated the Earls of Hereford, Surrey and Arundel, increasing their feelings of hostility towards him, as they felt he was both arrogant and low-born. They also hated the fact that he monopolised Edward II's attention, being constantly present at court when Edward saw his barons, earls, and other nobles. Edward II, King of England, ascended to the throne of England at his coronation on the 20th of July 1307 at Carlisle Castle. He was named King of England and Lord of Ireland, adding another 2 titles to the 4 he already held, and luckily for Edward, opposition to the royals was minimal at this time, as the Earl of Norfolk and the Earl of Hereford, who had caused Edward I some trouble, had recently died, and Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester, were his cousin and nephew respectively. As well as this, Walter Langton, the royal treasurer and Gaveston's enemy, who had clashed with Edward II in 1305, was fired, his lands were taken, and he was imprisoned. However, Archbishop Winchelsea of Canterbury, who had been exiled by his father, was restored to the bishopric by the Pope at Edward's request. This action would prove to be one of Edward's many mistakes as king, as Winchelsea would become one of Edward's fiercest enemies. Then, on the 26th of December 1307, Edward appointed Gaveston as Custo Regni, or Keeper of the Realm, while he travelled to France to marry his bride Isabella, giving the nobles even more reason to dislike Gaveston, as such a prominent role would normally be carried out by a high court official, a member of the royal family, or an archbishop, and so Edward's actions gave Gaveston power over the realm, confirmed by a great seal. Edward and Isabella had been promised to each other since 1299, when Edward was 15 and Isabella was 3 or 4, and in Boulogne in France, on the 25th of January 1308, Edward II married the 12-year-old Isabella, who was 11 years his junior, and reportedly very beautiful, as well as greedy and extremely extravagant, but also compassionate, pious, and courageous, and their early marriage, at least until the 1370s, was quite successful, Isabella proving to be an ally and great companion to Edward, with Isabella becoming pregnant with their first child 4 years after their marriage at the age of 16. The negotiations with Philip IV over the size of Isabella's dowry had not been easy for the English royals, during which Edward agreed to pay homage to Philip for the Duchy of Aquitaine and to finish the implementation of the 1303 Treaty of Paris. In return, Philip gave Isabella wedding gifts worth over 21,000 livres and, reputedly, a fragment of the True Cross, and Edward gave his bride a psalter, an illuminated manuscript containing the Book of Psalms. Their coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on Sunday the 25th of February 1308 in the presence of the nobles of England and France. The abbey had been restored and was adorned with a fountain producing wine, as well as marble tables and 40 ovens, and it was Piers Gaveston, immediately preceding the King and Queen in the procession, who carried the royal crown of Edward the Confessor, the most sacred of all the royal regalia carried at the ceremony, which was carried out of the abbey by Henry Woodlock, the Bishop of Winchester. Edward entered the abbey dressed in green silk and walking on a carpet of petals, and it was recorded in the Annals Paulini that Gaveston was so elegantly dressed in purple silk encrusted with pearls that he even outshone the king. Furthermore, Gaveston also led the procession out of the abbey, carrying the royal sword of Edward the Confessor, Curtana, which had been carried into the abbey by the Earl of Lancaster. In addition, the banqueting hall walls were adorned with Edward and Gaveston's arms rather than Edward and Isabella's, and Gaveston took pride of place next to Edward II and was the subject of his rapt attention. All this was seen as rather insulting to the young Queen Isabella, and only served to anger the English nobles further, as well as the French king. Indeed, Isabella wrote to her father that Edward was an entire stranger to my bed, and suggested that Gaveston was the cause of this. However, it should be remembered that marriages to young brides at this time were marriages in name only until the girl was of childbearing age, so Edward's inattention to Isabella can be understood in this context, as she was only 12 at that time and considered young even by the standards of the period, and so, for their first years together, Edward would probably have employed the sexual services of a mistress. Whilst the marriage of Edward II and Isabella did not get off to the best of starts, there is evidence from their letters to suggest that there developed a real affection between them, Edward calling Isabella "my dear heart," and Isabella referring to Edward II as "my very sweetheart." And indeed, their marriage produced 4 children. Their first son was the future King Edward III, born in 1312. Their second son, John of Eltham, was born in 1316. Their first daughter, Eleanor of Woodstock, was born in 1318, and Joan was born in 1321, and Edward's illegitimate son Adam was probably born in about 1307, before Isabella and Edward were married. The early days of their marriage, however, were not an easy time for Edward, as the favouritism that he showed to Piers Gaveston led the country to the brink of civil war. Indeed, the position of the nobles was also held by Philip IV of France, who saw his daughter's treatment by Edward as caused by Gaveston, and Edward's stepmother, who was also Philip's half-sister Margaret, also had reason to dislike Gaveston and was said to have sent £40,000 to the English nobles to fund their opposition of him. Although Gaveston's return from exile in 1307 had initially been accepted by the earls, opposition was beginning to grow once more, not least because of the influence he held over Edward. As one chronicler put it, 2 kings reigning in one kingdom, the one in name and the other in deed. And he also provoked anger concerning his prominent role at Edward's coronation, and perhaps as a result of this animosity, he was accused both of stealing royal funds as well as Isabella's wedding gifts. Indeed, at the Parliament of February 1308, the earls refused to discuss government reform with Edward until the matter of Gaveston had been resolved, and the heated discussion was only cooled with the intervention of the Earl of Lincoln, Henry de Lacy, who asked the other earls to back down, and it was only Hugh Despencer the Elder who supported Edward. However, at a session of Parliament in May of 1308, the opposition of the nobles to Gaveston resulted in Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, requesting that Gaveston be exiled to Aquitaine under threat of excommunication should he return, and so, faced with civil war by this time, Edward II agreed to exile his favourite Piers Gaveston, who had until the 25th of June to leave England or face excommunication, and, although Edward agreed initially, he decided instead to send Gaveston across the Irish Sea and made him King's Lieutenant of Ireland. At a third meeting of Parliament in August 1308 to discuss reform, Edward put forward a plan for another military campaign against Scotland, but this was sidelined, and secretly Edward began negotiations with Pope Clement V as well as Philip IV in order to secure the return of Gaveston to England by offering to suppress the Knights Templars and to release Walter Langton from prison. At a further meeting of Parliament in 1309, the earls, still refusing to allow Gaveston to return from exile, offered Edward further taxes in return for his agreement to a programme of governmental reform. However, after Edward assured the Pope that the conflict surrounding Gaveston had subsided, and in the presence of concerns over how the original decision to exile him had been taken, the Pope decided to annul the threat of excommunication, and so the way was left open for Gaveston to return to England. Gaveston did, in fact, arrive back in England in June of 1309, and at the next Parliament, in August, Edward made concessions to the earls who had opposed Gaveston, by limiting the powers of the royal steward and the marshal of the royal household, as well as agreeing to limit the crown's powers of purveyance, which was the forced selling of provisions for the army at low prices. He also agreed to cancel recently enacted customs legislation. In return, Parliament agreed that Edward should receive more taxes to fund his campaigns in Scotland. It seemed at this point that a compromise might have been reached. However, on his return, Gaveston continued to anger the earls with his arrogant and haughty manner, even seemingly provoking them by giving them insulting nicknames such as the Black Dog of Arden for the Earl of Warwick, Joseph the Jew for the Earl of Pembroke, Churl for the Earl of Lancaster, Whoreson for the Earl of Gloucester, and Burst Belly for the Earl of Lincoln. In fact, Warwick was recorded as saying, quote, "If he calls me a dog, be sure that I will bite him so soon as I shall perceive my opportunity." The unrest culminated in the earls coming to the Parliament of February 1310, armed and demanding that Edward put right the problems facing the realm at that time. These issues were that the hard-won lands his father had acquired in Scotland were now being lost again to Scotland, and that Edward was being misled by evil counsel and was wasting treasury money, and further, that he could not manage his own household, as his officials would take goods from the poor by the misuse of his powers of purveyance, and that he had brought shame on the country, which was now divided. It was then that Edward, faced with a possible revolt, was forced to agree in March 1310 to the formation of a group of 21 earls known as the Lords Ordainer, to replace Gaveston as Edward's counsel and reform the governance of England as well as Edward's own household. Then, in September of 1310, Edward and Gaveston took an army of 4,700 men to Scotland, but Robert the Bruce would not give battle, and so, with little progress made over the winter and supplies and money running low, Edward returned south in the summer of 1311. However, in Edward's absence in Scotland, Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, had died. As well as this, Edward's regent Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, had also died. With Lincoln's death, Edward's cousin Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, grew even more powerful as he inherited Lincoln's earldoms through his wife Lincoln's sister, and so now held Lancaster, Leicester, Lincoln, Salisbury, and Derby, with an income of around £11,000 a year from his lands, making him by far the most powerful and wealthy earl in England, and he had wielded this power whilst Edward was in Scotland, as Lancaster was duty-bound to give homage to Edward for the lands he held, but refused to do so in Scotland, forcing Edward to cross the Tweed to accept homage from Lancaster in Haggerston. During Edward's absence in Scotland, the Ordainers had drawn up the Ordinances of 1311, which Edward accepted in October 1311. The reforms limited the king's authority to go to war or to grant lands without Parliament's approval. It also gave Parliament control of the royal administration, as well as abolishing the system of purveyance, and it also excluded the borrowing of money from the Italian Frescobaldi bankers, to whom Edward, by this time, owed £21,000. In addition, a system was implemented to check the ordinances were being kept, but most devastating for Edward, the ordinances exiled Gaveston once more, insisting that he should not be allowed to live in any lands owned by Edward, including Gascony and Ireland, and that he should lose his titles. Edward was forced to accept Gaveston's exile, although it took 6 weeks for him to agree to that particular clause of the ordinances, and later he sought advice on the exiles of others as to how he might bring him back, but ultimately Gaveston was ordered into exile by the 1st of November 1311. However, he left later than ordered on the 3rd or 4th of November from the Thames, possibly for northern France or Flanders. Despite Gaveston's departure from England, the tension between Edward and the Earls remained high, and when further ordinances ordered that other members of his household, sympathetic to Gaveston, should leave, this further angered the king, and perhaps feeling that his royal power was being stripped, he decided to revoke the ordinances and recalled Gaveston from exile in early 1312, giving him back his title Earl of Cornwall. Edward spent Christmas with Isabella, but left Westminster on the 27th of December 1311 and headed north with Gaveston's wife, his niece Margaret, who was now heavily pregnant, arriving in York, where Margaret gave birth on the 12th of January 1311 to Gaveston's daughter Joan, named after Edward's sister Joan of Acre, and so Edward then met up with Gaveston on the 13th of January, and they travelled together to York so that Gaveston could see his wife and newborn daughter. The Earls met in London and stopped further funding for the king and planned their capture of Gaveston. However, Edward was bent on saving his favourite at all costs, even asking Robert the Bruce to give him sanctuary. But Robert refused, and the desperate request showed that Edward's love of Gaveston was evidently more important to him than the overlordship of Scotland, the loyalty of his earls, and perhaps even his throne. Isabella then left for York, and she was reunited with her husband in late February 1312 at Bishopthorpe just south of York, where they promptly conceived their first son, who would later become King Edward III. Subsequently, Edward and Gaveston, who the Archbishop of Canterbury had excommunicated in March, left for Newcastle on the 5th of April 1312, with Isabella also arriving there on the 22nd of April, later moving on to Tynemouth Priory, maybe because by this time Gaveston was ill. They were pursued to Newcastle by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. Despite this, Edward found time to celebrate his 28th birthday on the 25th of April by buying Isabella some large white pearls with £40 he had borrowed from a Genoese merchant, and during this time Edward also gave Gaveston custody of Scarborough Castle on order he should give it over to no one but the king himself should he have need of it, showing that Edward by this time was resigned to civil war, and he had also ordered his vassals in France, the Counts of Foix and Armagnac, and the Lord of Albret, along with 120 Gascon viscounts and barons, to come to his aid in England with armed men and horses. When, on the 3rd of May, Edward heard of the imminent arrival of Lancaster and his army, they fled to join Isabella at Tynemouth, and on the 5th of May they travelled by sea to Scarborough Castle, leaving behind much of their household and valuables, with Isabella travelling by land instead. Edward then left Gaveston at Scarborough and travelled to Knaresborough and then York, where he met up with Isabella again on the 14th of May. Meanwhile, Lancaster seized the king's possessions left behind at Tynemouth, which included a gold ring with an enormous ruby called the Cherry, and a gold cup studded with jewels, along with 63 horses. On the day the king left Scarborough Castle for York, Gaveston was besieged there by John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, Henry Percy, Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, and Sir Roger de Clifford, and despite the king requesting them to desist, Gaveston surrendered to them on the 19th of May, on condition he be kept unharmed and under house arrest at his own castle in Wallingford, until he could account for his actions to Parliament on the 1st of August. Placed under the custody of the Earl of Pembroke, Gaveston was taken south to Wallingford, but they stopped at Deddington, some 30 miles short of Wallingford, on the 9th of June, and that night Pembroke left Gaveston under guard at Deddington Priory while he visited his wife, Beatrice, and it was on the morning of the 10th of June that Gaveston awoke to the sound of horses and men surrounding the priory. It was Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, who Gaveston had insultingly called the Black Dog of Arden. He had come for revenge. Warwick then took Gaveston to Warwick Castle, after publicly walking him through the streets of Deddington, stripped of his belt of knighthood, barefoot and bareheaded. He was thrown into the dungeons of Warwick Castle and put in chains, and after a brief trial on the 18th of June, he was found guilty of being a traitor by breaking the ordinances, and was run through and beheaded at Blacklow Hill the following day by the Welsh men-at-arms of the Earl of Lancaster. His body was taken in by Dominican monks, who sewed back his head, tended his body, and dressed him, which was paid for by both Edward and Gaveston's widow Margaret, whose family would later be provided for by Edward, but the Dominicans could not bury Gaveston, who was, after all, excommunicate, and so he was not buried until the 2nd of January 1315, when his funeral was held in King's Langley Priory in Hertfordshire, after the Archbishop of Canterbury, Walter Reynolds, absolved his excommunication. The killing of Gaveston caused further division in England, as Edward grieved deeply and was furious with Lancaster in particular, and the division caused by his treatment of Gaveston would cause a permanent rift between the men. Furthermore, the Earls of Pembroke and Surrey also disagreed with what Lancaster had done and moved their support to Edward, and the threat of civil war loomed once again. In December of 1312, the Earl of Pembroke brokered a peace treaty which would pardon the earls for their involvement in the killing of Gaveston in return for their support for another campaign in Scotland, but an agreement was not reached straight away, and negotiations continued throughout 1313, and a step toward peace was attained when the treaty was finally formalized at a parliament in October of the same year. In June of 1313, Edward and Isabella travelled to Paris with Pembroke, Richmond and other loyalists, including Hugh Despenser the Elder and Henry Beaumont, to meet with Philip IV to discuss disagreements over the administration of Gascony. However, it was probably also on Edward's agenda to garner support from the French king in his disputes with the English earls. Their visit was an opportunity for Philip to demonstrate his great wealth and power to the English king, and so their tour included the knighting of Philip's son and 200 other men in an elegant and grand ceremony in Notre Dame, and there were also banquets held along the River Seine. As well as this, both men made a declaration that they would join a crusade to the Levant against the Muslims of Egypt, and they also agreed terms for settling their differences in Gascony. The success of the trip was only marred by a fire which broke out in Edward's quarters. On his return from his successful trip to France, Edward found his position in England strengthened both politically and financially, as the earls had agreed to the peace treaty by October 1313. As well as this, Parliament had agreed to the raising of taxes and loans of £25,000 from the Pope and £33,000 from Philip, as well as further loans organised by Edward's new Italian banker, Antonio Pesagno. In addition, by this time, Edward had an heir, as Isabella had given birth on the 13th of November 1312 to a son, Edward, at Windsor. Baby Edward's arrival was a cause for celebration and a reason for the country to come together again, He was made Earl of Chester at the age of 12 days, and to mark his birth, Edward had raised his 12-year-old half-brother, Thomas of Brotherton, to the rank of Earl of Norfolk. However, some earls were still disgruntled about other loyalist supporters of the king and their influence over him, including Hugh Despencer the Elder, who had consistently remained loyal to Edward. As well as rumblings of disquiet at home, Edward still had Robert the Bruce to deal with, who had by now taken most of the castles in Scotland once held by Edward, and so he set out for the north with a 15,000 to 20,000 strong force supported by Gloucester, Hereford and Pembroke, as well as Hugh Despencer and Roger Clifford. However, the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick, Arundel and Surrey were missing, and they sent the minimum forces they were legally obliged to, fearing that a victory in Scotland for Edward would mean that they would be at risk from his forces once they returned. By late May, Edward had reached Berwick, where he heard news that Stirling Castle was under siege from Robert the Bruce, and the English commander of Stirling sent word that unless Edward arrived with relief forces by the 24th of June, he would be forced to surrender. Meanwhile, Robert's forces were preparing for Edward's arrival, and on the 23rd of June 1314, the two sides met on the high ground of Bannockburn, surrounded by the marshy land bordering the burn. With Robert's Scottish forces of 500 cavalry and 6,000 infantry spearmen divided into 3 divisions or schiltrons under his command, alongside him were his brother Edward Bruce and his nephew, the Earl of Moray. On the first day of battle, Robert killed Sir Henry de Bohun with a blow of his battle-axe. Gloucester and Hereford quarrelled over who should lead the vanguard, and Gloucester was lucky to escape with his life, and so the English then withdrew for the night. On the following day, the 24th of June, Edward encountered Robert's troops unexpectedly at New Park, with his forces in marching formation instead of battle formation, as Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish noble fighting on Edward's side, had defected and informed the Scottish army of Edward's position, and earlier that day Gloucester had argued fiercely with Edward as he felt the troops needed rest before continuing the attack, but Edward disagreed, and so to defend his honour, Gloucester led the first attack of the vanguard against the Scottish infantry, in which he was killed. Edward's archers were at the rear of his formation and therefore unable to break up Robert's spearmen, who crushed Edward's cavalry as they struggled to fight in the cramped terrain, and so the English army were defeated in a pitched battle in which the Earl of Hereford was captured and the Earl of Gloucester, Sir Roger de Clifford, and Sir Giles d'Argenton, the third best knight in Europe, all lost their lives. Edward was dragged away from the fighting by Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, and Sir Giles d'Argenton when they realised that all was lost, after which the battle turned into a rout, with the pursuing Scottish army killing the remaining English forces in retreat, and while the English were suffering huge losses, which historian Peter Rees puts at 11,000 infantrymen, Edward retreated to Dunbar, then Berwick, and finally York, during which time Stirling Castle finally fell. Pembroke, Edward's saviour at Bannockburn, and Hereford, released from captivity by the Scots, remained loyal to Edward, as did Henry Beaumont, Hugh Despencer the Elder, and his son Hugh Despencer the Younger. In fact, in the years following Gaveston's death, the Despensers helped fill the gap left by the removal of the king's favourite. During the years 1314 to 1317, increasingly harsh winters followed by wet summers throughout Europe resulted in flash floods in 1315, which destroyed arable lands, resulting in the death of thousands of sheep and cattle from disease and starvation and, ultimately, famine throughout England for 2 years, as an 80% deficit in crops meant that starving people resorted to eating bird droppings, pets, damp and rotten corn, and on occasion each other. The loss of export revenue for wool and the decrease in meat supplies and resulting increase in food prices put pressure on the military garrison near Scotland, while Robert the Bruce pressed further south into England's territories, perhaps spurred on by the loss of English earls at Bannockburn, as well as the death of Warwick, who died in August 1315, and although Edward undertook a military campaign in 1319 to stop the advance, it was unsuccessful, as the famine made it increasingly difficult to keep his garrisons supplied with food. Furthermore, the requisitioning of food for the royal court throughout the famine years brought more discontentment with Edward's rule, as the famine and the Scottish failures were felt to be a punishment from God, and opposition also grew once more around Edward's treatment of his royal favourites. On the death of Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester at Bannockburn, his estates were split between his 3 sisters, as he and his wife Maud had no children of their own, and so 3 of those loyal to Edward, Hugh de Audley, Roger d'Amory, and Hugh de Spencer the Younger, received large fortunes, as they were already married to the sisters of the Earl of Gloucester, Margaret, the widow of Gaveston, Elizabeth and Eleanor respectively, and whilst the 3 received equal portions of de Clare's fortune, Hugh de Spencer the Younger also received the entire lordship of Glamorgan in Wales, the most important of the de Clare lands politically. From being a landless knight, Hugh de Spencer the Younger had married into the wealthy de Clare family, had become the King's Chamberlain, and had acquired Glamorgan in the Welsh Marches in 1317, and both he and his father were loyal to Edward, but Hugh the Younger would develop an ever-increasingly close relationship with Edward over the coming years, as he would rely on Hugh the Younger for advice, and he was also privy to all Edward's court business. In the words of one chronicler, Edward loved him dearly with all his heart and mind. But, despite acquiring so much land, de Spencer the Younger decided to also impinge on the lands of neighbouring Welsh Marcher lords, causing resentment from Roger Mortimer, the Earl of Hereford, his nephew Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, Hugh d'Amory, Hugh de Audley, and Roger d'Amory, who rose up in May 1321, along with Lancaster, and marched through the land, causing damage and destruction and seizing the de Spencer lands in protest over the king's favouritism towards them, and although this rebellion was crushed, resistance continued under Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the Marcher lord's ally. Edward faced further conflict and possible civil war when the earls, led by Lancaster, pressured Edward to re-implement the ordinances of 1311, removing a number of royal ministers, replacing all the sheriffs in England, ordering the resumption of royal grants, and putting pressure on Edward to hear petitions of grievance and complaint from his subjects, and, furthermore, much to Edward's displeasure, Hugh de Spencer the Elder and Archbishop Reynolds were removed from their posts in government. Lancaster took virtual control of government when he became the head of a royal council in 1316, which was formed to implement the reforms, but he failed to fulfill the role, becoming isolated from the other earls as well as government, and refusing to meet Edward at Parliament for the next 2 years, bringing governance to a standstill. But after negotiations involving the Earl of Pembroke, further conflict was avoided with the Treaty of Lake in August 1318, which re-established Edward's control, pardoned Lancaster, and established a new royal council to uphold the ordinances. Despite the treaty, however, between 1317 and 1321, relations between Edward, Lancaster and the Earls deteriorated further, not least because of Edward's treatment of his favourites, and in June 1321 Lancaster held a meeting of the Earls and clergy which determined that the Despensers had broken the ordinances, and despite Edward's attempt to broker peace, the opposition insisted on the exile of the Despensers, which Edward agreed to for the sake of the realm, but only after Isabella had begged him on her knees. However, Edward swore he would have his revenge, and aided by his half-brothers, some of the earls and clergy and the Earl of Pembroke, he deliberately created an excuse to go to war by having Isabella stop off on her way to pilgrimage at Leeds Castle, which was the stronghold of Bartholomew of Badlesmere, where his wife Margaret, falling for the trick, refused Isabella admittance and killed several of Isabella's contingent, thus giving the king reason to wage war. Edward would soon regain control of the southeast, as Lancaster refused to help Badlesmere, who was his enemy, and in January 1322, with the help of the Despensers, who were able to secretly return from exile in mid-January, Edward overcame the opposition forces of the Marcher Lords along the River Severn. He was able to advance into the Welsh Marches, where Bridgenorth was burned, and Roger Mortimer and his uncle Roger Mortimer de Chirk surrendered to Edward on the 22nd of January 1322, and then, in February, Hugh Audley the Elder and Maurice de Berkeley also surrendered, and Edward confiscated Berkeley Castle from Sir Maurice. Edward was winning not only militarily, but also politically, as in February 1322 a letter came to light that Edward had distributed widely, which showed that Lancaster had been negotiating with the Scots to overcome Edward, and many of Lancaster's allies became wary of supporting him for fear of what would happen to them should he lose, and it was at this time that the Welsh nobility also lent their support to Edward, as the Marcher Lords had been more of a threat to their lands than Edward. Only 10 days after Lancaster's letters were published, he was declared a traitor to the realm, and Edward ordered the Earls of Kent and Surrey to capture Pontefract Castle. Then, as Lancaster and the Earls loyal to him attempted to make their way to Carlisle with a force of around 700 men, they were stopped by Andrew Harclay, the warden of Carlisle Castle, who had an accumulated army of 4,000 men. After the Battle of Burton Bridge in February 1322, Edward had crossed the River Trent and joined Harclay at Borough Bridge, where they engaged Lancaster and his forces at the Battle of Borough Bridge on the 16th of March, where Lancaster and the Lancastrian loyalists were defeated. After a trial at Pontefract, Lancaster was found guilty of treason and beheaded in March 1322, after which Edward repealed the ordinances through the Statute of York at a parliament held on the 2nd of May 1322, retaining only 6 clauses concerning the administration of the household and appointment of sheriffs, and agreeing taxes for a fresh campaign against Scotland, which took back royal power unequivocally, and so by now Edward was without a doubt back in charge. Following the Despenser War, the 2 Roger Mortimers, Chirk and Wigmore, were sentenced to death, but had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment, and they were imprisoned in the Tower of London, from where Roger Mortimer de Wigmore escaped in August 1323 before fleeing to France, and Maurice de Berkeley, Hugh Audley the Younger and the Elder were also imprisoned, while, in a last show of resistance, the Marcher Lords attempted to free other captives from both Windsor and Wallingford castles. The remaining supporters of Lancaster were either executed or imprisoned, and their lands were seized, which resulted in Edward becoming hugely rich, as, by 1326, his treasury contained £62,000, with which he rewarded his loyal supporters with titles and lands. Andrew Harclay was given the earldom of Carlisle. The loyal Earls of Surrey and Pembroke were both given land holdings. The Earl of Arundel was given lands confiscated from Roger Mortimer of Chirk, as well as his title of Justice of Wales. The king's half-brother Edmund was given land and castles in the Midlands and Wales, and Edward's young son, John of Eltham, was given the Lancastrian castle of Tutbury at the age of only 6. As well as this, Hugh Despencer the Elder was given the earldom of Winchester, along with 5 separate grants of land, including Lancaster's territory of Denbigh in North Wales. Hugh Despencer the Younger received all the lands of the earldom of Gloucester, but not the title, and he was also given extensive land holdings in Wales, which were added to substantially over the coming years, in effect making him Lord of South Wales, with an income of around £5,000 per year. The king was granted £40,000 for another campaign in Scotland, which came to nothing, but which also resulted in the death of his illegitimate son Adam, and almost ended in Queen Isabella's capture when she was forced to flee Tynemouth by sea. Andrew Harclay tried to negotiate a peace treaty independently with Robert the Bruce under terms which would force Edward to recognise Robert as rightful King of Scotland in return for a cessation to the invasion of England. Unsurprisingly, the king was furious at Harclay's unauthorised intervention and immediately cruelly executed him as a common traitor, but the king did agree to a 13-year truce with Scotland. Bolstered by his swelling coffers and his victory over Lancaster, Edward became emboldened, and his loyal dispensers gathered the fruits of their loyalty whilst dealing cruelly with anyone who crossed them. Moreover, there was still discontentment with Edward's favouritism of them. Indeed, the chronicler Thomas de la Moor stated that under Edward, England had 3 kings at once. However, the success enjoyed by Edward would not last for long, as stories began to circulate of miracles happening, both at Lancaster's tomb and at the gallows used to execute his followers, and in addition, law and order broke down, with the confusion caused by the many seizures of land, and then, on the 1st of August 1323, at the Tower of London, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, now landless, escaped from his dungeon and fled to France, where he was welcomed by the new King of France, Charles IV, Edward's brother-in-law. The new King Charles IV was eager to assert his authority over England, and a disagreement over Edward's lands at Saint-Sardo in 1324 gave him the excuse he needed, and so he invaded Edward's territory of Gascony over a dispute concerning the killing of a French sergeant who intended to build a fortified town in a disputed region on the Gascon border, which Edward denied responsibility for, and sent the Earl of Pembroke to protest, but he died en route, and instead of compromising, Charles intensified his attack. In August 1324, the French king's uncle, Charles of Valois, invaded Aquitaine. In response, Edward ordered the arrest of any French citizen in England and seized all French-held lands in England, including Isabella's. And so the clergy and earls recommended the raising of an army of 11,000 men to invade Gascony, which Edward sent to France, led by the Earl of Surrey, as he felt that if he left England accompanied by his loyal earls, that he would leave the country open to invasion or rebellion. In the meantime, Edward recommenced negotiations with King Charles IV, who suggested that Isabella travel to France along with Prince Edward to give homage to the French king for Gascony, and in return, Charles would end the war and return the disputed region of Agenais. But as Edward was concerned about sending his son to France, he sent Isabella alone instead in March 1325. The negotiations were not easy for Isabella, but she appealed to her brother Charles directly, and it was eventually agreed that Edward would pay homage in person for his lands in Gascony. However, as Edward was still concerned about possible uprisings in England were he to leave, he gave the Duchy of Aquitaine to his son Edward instead and sent him to pay homage to Charles in his place. Therefore, the young Prince Edward crossed the Channel and paid homage to his uncle, the French King Charles IV, in September 1325, and following this, Edward had expected the return of his family to England, but instead, Isabella remained in France. Edward and Isabella's marriage had been successful in the beginning, but by the time she left for France in 1325, the Queen was feeling discontent with Edward's treatment of her, not least because of his behaviour towards his favourites, but there were other issues, as Isabella seemed to have disliked Hugh Despenser the Younger personally, maybe because of his mistreatment of high-born women at court, or maybe because she felt humiliated that her own money from Edward came via Despenser. She was also embarrassed that she had cause to flee Scottish forces on no fewer than 3 occasions during her marriage, the last of which, in 1322, she blamed Despenser for directly. In addition to this, Edward had also arranged terms with Robert the Bruce, which had disadvantaged the Beaumonts, who were landowners in Scotland and friends of Isabella. She was also unhappy about the seizure of her own lands in 1324 and the arrest of her entire household, and perhaps, worst of all, Edward had taken away her children and given custody of them to the wife of Hugh Despenser the Younger, Eleanor de Clare, who was also employed to spy on Isabella's correspondence. Unsurprisingly, Isabella was, by this time, happy to leave England, and after her duties were completed negotiating on behalf of England, she spent the summer in France, touring her brother's properties, and it would soon become apparent that Isabella would not be returning, and she wrote to Edward complaining about her treatment and Edward's favour of Despenser. Isabella had met Roger Mortimer of Wigmore at Christmas 1325, and by February 1326 had formed a relationship with Edward's enemy, with whom she had much in common. They both wanted the removal of Edward from power, as well as to be rid of the Despensers, and so they plotted together. Edward, by this time, had heard of their relationship and asked Pope John XXII to force the French king to intervene on his behalf, and, facing excommunication, Charles was forced to demand that Isabella and Mortimer leave France. Isabella and Roger Mortimer attracted a following of Edward's opponents whilst in Paris, and sought safe haven with William the Count of Hainaut, and whilst there, Mortimer proposed a marriage between Prince Edward and 12-year-old Philippa, the daughter of Count William, and so the marriage was agreed on the 27th of August, and in return for this prestigious alliance with the heir to the English throne and a sizable dowry for the bride, Count William provided 132 transport vessels and 8 warships to assist in Mortimer's invasion of England. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer's invasion of England was launched, with a fleet comprised of 95 ships. Meanwhile, in England, Edward had been preparing for an attack either from France or from Mortimer, and in anticipation he prepared fleets at Portsmouth in the south and Orwell on the east coast near present-day Ipswich. As well as this, Edward also tried to rally the people to support him in the event of an invasion. However, his support was weak from the local peoples, and his nobles were either incompetent or disloyal, as when he ordered some 2,000 men to gather at Orwell, only 55 actually arrived. On the 24th of September 1326, Roger Mortimer, Isabella and Prince Edward, accompanied by Edward's half-brother Edmund of Woodstock, landed on the east coast at Orwell with a small force of 700, but were met with no resistance, and instead the enemies of Edward and the Despensers came to join them, including Edward's other half-brother Thomas of Brotherton and Henry of Lancaster, who had inherited the title from his brother Thomas of Lancaster. Whilst residing at the Tower of London, Edward tried to raise support in the capital. However, instead, there was anarchy in London and mobs killed Edward's remaining officials, including his treasurer Walter Stapledon, in St. Paul's Cathedral, taking the tower and releasing Edward's prisoners, and so Edward fled the city, accompanied by the Despensers, reaching Gloucester between the 9th and 12th of October, with Mortimer and Isabella giving chase, with an ever-increasing force of local allies, some motivated by Isabella's promise of monetary rewards for their support, published on the Eleanor Cross at Cheapside. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger set sail from Chepstow, headed for Lundy and then Ireland, in the hope of raising a fresh army. But bad weather forced them back to Cardiff, from where they retreated to Caerphilly Castle, and in Edward's absence it was now that his rule collapsed and Isabella's supporters took over the administration of the country, backed by the clergy. Meanwhile, Isabella's forces were surrounding Bristol, where Hugh Despenser the Elder had taken refuge. He promptly surrendered and was executed, whilst Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger fled Caerphilly Castle on the 2nd of November, leaving valuables behind, including £13,000 in cash. However, they were betrayed and captured north of Caerphilly and escorted to Monmouth Castle, and then on to Henry Lancaster's castle at Kenilworth, whilst Edward's remaining supporters, besieged in Caerphilly Castle, finally surrendered in April 1327. A parliament was called by Isabella and Mortimer, and Edward was forced to relinquish his throne on the grounds that his weak leadership and personal faults had driven the country to the brink of disaster, and as such, he was incompetent to rule. Following that, on the 20th of January 1327, Henry of Lancaster and the bishops of Winchester and Lincoln met privately with Edward and informed him that his son Edward would only inherit his throne if he were to abdicate. With tears in his eyes, Edward agreed to abdicate, and Sir William Trussell, representing the kingdom, withdrew his fealty and formally ended Edward II's reign, and so his son, Prince Edward, was proclaimed king on the 25th of January 1327 in London, and crowned King Edward III at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of February at the age of 14. It was now time for Isabella and Mortimer to take revenge, and so Hugh Despenser the Younger was sent to trial, declared a traitor, and sentenced to death by disembowelment, castration, and quartering, and was executed on the 24th of November 1326, whilst Edward's former Chancellor, Robert Baldock, died in Fleet Prison, and the Earl of Arundel was beheaded. The victor's problem lay, however, on what was to be done with Edward of Carnarvon, as the old king would now be known, a remaining king, but a possible future threat, as those opposed to the new regime were making plans to free Edward, and so the old king was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a more secure position, where Edward arrived on the 5th of April 1327. Edward was kept under the custody of Mortimer's son-in-law Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers, who were given £5 a day to look after Edward, and, despite records showing luxury goods being bought for him, doubts exist as to how well looked after he actually was. As some chroniclers suggest, he may well have been mistreated, and also, during this time, there were several attempts from those loyal to Edward to free him from captivity. However, on the 21st of September 1327, Isabella and Mortimer's problems were solved when Edward II died at Berkeley Castle at the age of 43, supposedly from natural causes, but the timing of his death was most opportune for the couple and suspicions arose as to the circumstances surrounding his death. On the 23rd of September 1327, Edward III was informed of his father's death, and following this, several of those who might have been involved in Edward's untimely demise fled, including Sir Thomas Gurney, Maltravers, and William Ockley. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as de facto rulers from 1327 to 1330, due to the age of Edward III, during which time they signed the Treaty of Northampton, making peace with the Scots. In addition, they both amassed and spent great wealth, both actions being highly unpopular with the people of England, and Mortimer also lost the favour of young Edward III, and in 1330 the young king staged a coup d'etat at Nottingham Castle, arresting Mortimer and later executing him in November 1330 for 14 counts of treason, including the murder of Edward II. The new King Edward III blamed Mortimer for all the recent problems of the realm, effectively releasing his father of all guilt concerning the events, perhaps out of love, or perhaps to increase the legitimacy of his own reign, and he was also merciful and generous to Isabella, giving her a suitable alliance